guest who excites me very much, Maureen Caudill, the author of Suddenly Psychic. She's a physicist, and she became suddenly psychic. And we have a lot in common because we both have been visited by our deceased cats. And there's a wonderful quote from this book where Maureen says, "It isn't that the mystics have changed their views of the world. Instead, science is at last beginning to lose just a tiny bit of the arrogance that insisted that cold materialism was the only way to understand the universe." What a journey we're going to take. Maureen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Anne.
Well, tell me, now you are a scientist, you are a physicist. Tell me a little bit about your scientific background.
Okay. I was trained in physics at the University of Connecticut. I have a master's degree from Cornell. I spent over 20 years not actually doing physics, but in the computer science industry.
Uh-huh.
And my specialty was artificial intelligence and neural networks. And I spent about 15 years working in that field and doing cutting-edge research for the DoD in
That's the Department of Defense, folks. That's serious stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. My clients were the three-letter agencies, the intelligence agencies, typically, and basically doing research in how to make computers act more like people, be more intelligent, however you define that term.
Well, you know, it's very interesting. We have often found with the people we have met and interviewed that the government, the Department of Defense, is much more on the cutting edge than people think. And a lot of people who are on the edge have worked for them. In fact, someone we worked very closely with for many years who's now died, who Whitley has been in contact with, even though he has died, and he's still doing scientific work, just like your cat Sammy is still doing cat work, was Bill Mallow, who's worked for the Southwest Research Institute, who did a lot of CIA work. But that's just an aside. Tell me more. Tell me about your journey.
Well, my journey didn't have anything to do with what I was doing professionally. In fact, it was almost antithetical to what I was doing during my day job. So
how'd you decide to do it? What happened?
Well, I had gone through a really difficult period. I had a period where I had taken a break from my career to stay home and look after my mom, and she died. And, in fact, I had 4 deaths in the space of about 4 months and had another person I was very close to be diagnosed as mortally ill. And the result of all that was I was really messed up. I was just personally completely frazzled, and somehow, by accident, if you believe in accidents, which I don't think I any longer believe in accidents.
I don't either. Go on.
Or coincidence. I don't believe in those either. Somehow, I ran across the website for the Monroe Institute.
Now that is a coincidence.
Yeah, because it's not exactly a big name website, and for some reason I was attracted to the concept of the Gateway Voyage program, which is a 1-week retreat in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, and at the time I was living in Southern California, and I thought, wow, that sounds like so cool, a whole week of nothing to do, and I hadn't had a vacation in a really long time.
Folks, this is where they teach you how to go out of your body.
Actually, it's not. They teach you how to go into altered states.
Oh, okay.
It's different from going out of your body. I mean, it's going out of your body. They're not opposites. But the goal of the Gateway Voyage program is not so much to teach you how to go out of body. It's to teach you how to go into altered states of consciousness and do it in a safe, controlled, reliable fashion. And they use a technology that they've developed over about 40 years called HemiSync. It's basically you put on a set of headphones and listen to the sound that's coming over your headphones. And within about 10 minutes, everybody's in an altered state of consciousness. I mean, it's very reliable. You can put it on to anybody. What appealed to me about that was it's a technology. Wow, I'm a techno-nerd. That just totally appealed to me completely.
So there are sciences. There is science at the edge, or maybe even on the other side of the edge.
Yes, and it's been, tested. It's safe. It's reliable, and it's science. It's sound. There's equipment. There's like stuff that lets you do it. It's not something vague and fuzzy like chanting or drumming, which, being a techie nerd, that just had no appeal to me whatsoever.
Although we do now understand how drumming gets people into all the states, but people didn't used to understand that. Go ahead.
Well, absolutely. It's not that those other techniques don't work, because they do. But being a techie nerd, I wanted the technological stuff. I wanted the machines to help me get there. And truthfully, I didn't really know what I'd signed up for. And so the first thing that happened, the program at TMI, at the Monroe Institute, which is called TMI, went from Saturday at dinner until Friday morning. And so Saturday afternoon is a period of sort of getting to know whoever the trainers are. There usually are 2 trainers for every program. And you have a one-on-one intake interview with one of the 2 trainers. Well, almost the first words out of my trainer's mouth in our intake interview was, now, don't worry if you don't go out of body on this program, because, not everybody goes out of body during Gateway. And I thought to myself, go out of your body? Why would anyone want to do that? And, oh, my, I think I've jumped down the wrong rabbit hole.
Oh.
And it got worse, because at dinner that night, after dinner, we all congregated in a room and did the typical thing that workshops do. Went around the room and everyone introduced themselves. And I realized that every single other participant in this program was a healer, a shaman, a meditator, a new ager of some sort. And I was the techie nerd in the entire group. And I was sure that I had completely jumped into the wrong place. I had no idea. I started wondering, can I get my money back? Can I just go hang out in a hotel in Charlottesville, Virginia until my plane takes off on Friday? How do I get out of this?
And yet you were probably the most valuable person there, because you came from science and not any sort of belief. And on this show and on our website, we think that skepticism is it's the only attitude. If you don't keep things in question, you don't find out anything. But go on.
Well, I think that's true. And I do have to say that within 48 hours of starting the program, my skepticism was in tatters. I found myself doing things that prior to the program I would have said were flat out impossible. And
like what? Like what? Tell me.
Well, I was remote viewing, for example. They called us. We were in a large group. They said, okay, we're writing down some latitude and longitude coordinates. I want you to describe the target that is at those latitude and longitude. Well, I'm not a cartographer. I don't know much, or a pilot. I don't know much about latitude and longitude other than very vague general terms. And yet I not only described the target, I actually drew 2 sketches of it that were in the exact perspective of the 2 photographs they told us showed us after the exercise was done. Then they did a second target, and the 2 trainers looked at each other and said, well, we can't remember what the coordinates of this one are, but the target is somewhere in North America. Describe the target.
So they gave you no information at all, basically.
Well, it's somewhere in North America.
Well, I guess that's information, yeah.
That certainly narrowed it down quite a lot. I mean, I knew not to draw the pyramids in Egypt, but I got that target too, and again drew it from the perspective of the photographs of the target that they showed us when the exercise was done. Now that completely blew me away. How was I able to do that? I actually named the building of the first target, and I mean, I just was flummoxed. I couldn't understand how that could happen. I also was doing things like I had communication with my best friend's deceased mother, got a message for her.
So you became a medium, at least for a moment. I know some mediums. They're fascinating.
That's right. I was channeling spiritual information. I was precognitive the whole week. One of the things they do in Gateway is they protect you. They don't give you an agenda saying this is such and such is going to happen. In fact, the trainers are very careful not to give you pre-warning about what's going to show up next.
Yeah.
Because you're supposed to experience it in the moment. I knew all the way through the week what was going to happen. And I had never heard of this program. I didn't know anyone who'd ever been to it and had no information about it. And yet I knew, an hour or so in advance, everything that was going to happen the whole week.
That's fascinating. And you talk about sound, and I wanted to interject this real quickly. There's some people, and these are archaeologists and serious scientists, think that the pyramids might have been built by harnessing the power of sound, because they have been able to levitate large items, large things that weigh a lot, with sound. And they think maybe the Egyptians knew how to do this. So
That's
sound
possible.
can be very powerful, and we don't use it. In our science, we don't really
true.
use it.
That's true. I do know that in the ancient Celts, pre-Roman Britain, many of the burial chambers in across northern Europe have special sound qualities that if you sit in the middle, in the central chamber, and have the wind whistle by the openings to that chamber, the frequencies are such that it puts you into altered states of consciousness. And this has been demonstrated.
Oh, that's
pretty
fascinating.
Clearly.
Oh.
So sound is enormously powerful.
That's fascinating. We really don't make much use of it. That's something that we just don't explore much in our spiritual quests in the West. That's very interesting. Well, Maureen, I'm having so much fun talking with you, but we're coming to a place where we need to take a little break, so we'll be right back. Hi, this is Ann Strieber. We're back talking to Maureen Caudill, Suddenly Psychic. And your website, I believe, is maureencaudill.net, and that's spelled MaureenCaudill.net. Am I right?
There's no dot between Maureen and Caudill.
Oh, okay.
MaureenCaudill.net.
Okay, but we've got to get the spelling right. Caudill. Okay.
Yeah.
I should have known better than that. Well, I want to ask you, it's very interesting. I wanted to mention real quickly, you talked about the Celts, and I've had some experiences with the Celts, with my experiences with the Green Man, which all our listeners know about. But we are going to have Rick Strassman, who you also talk about in your book, the fellow who did the DMT experiments, who's been on our show before, and we're going to talk to him again soon. And it's interesting, I sent him my adventures with the Green Man and the diary I wrote about someone actually seeing the Green Man, and it flipped him out. Because the people who took DMT under in his study saw beings from other worlds, real beings. And now, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that he has reported that consistently, and in fact, it was my understanding. I don't want to speak for him, but my understanding is that the consistency with which people saw beings from other realms, whether they're physical worlds or spiritual beings, has led him to some major conclusions in his book. I have read his book and think it's a wonderful contribution.
Well, now, you and I have something in common, is that other people see great beings, but we saw our cats. Tell me about that story.
The cat in question was a Russian blue, name of Samson, or Sammy as I called him. Very wise being. He was, at the time I went to the Gateway program, he had been seriously ill with kidney disease for almost 5 years, which is an impossibly long period of time. He wasn't very old. At that time, he was only 9.5 years old. So he had developed kidney disease when he was only 4. One of the things that I had done during Gateway, which boggled my head a little bit was I had decided that while I was gone, I was going to see if I could do some remote healing on him. I had heard the other participants talk about healing, didn't know how to do it myself, but went through a healing exercise, which I describe in more detail in the book if you're interested.
It's very interesting.
The day after I returned, he had a scheduled veterinary appointment to check up on what his condition was. And I was astonished by that, as was the vet, because the vet told me, based on his numbers of his test results, he really should have already died. Couldn't understand why he was still alive and expected him to be, comatose and withdrawn. And he wasn't. He was still my Sammy. He was very thin, very frail, but I had two smaller, younger cats at the time, and he still played with his younger siblings and just had a good time. I decided then that probably what my healing had done at best was the equivalent of dialysis. When a human has a kidney disease, they put them on a dialysis machine 2 or 3 times a week to clear the blood of toxins, which is what the function the kidneys perform in the body. And so I decided since there was absolutely nothing medically that could be done to preserve his life or lengthen his life, I decided I would just do a regular program of healing on him 2 or 3 or 4 times a week to see if I could continue the dialysis equivalent, whatever I had done. And that worked very well for several months. Now, bear in mind that when he'd had that checkup, the vet told me his lifespan was in a few days. And I kept him alive for 4 or 5 months after that by doing this regular remote healing. That itself sort of boggled my mind.
But then he told you it was time for him to go. And I quote, "I quite literally heard his voice saying, no, it's time for me to go now. You have to let me leave."
Yes. I sat down one Sunday afternoon to do a regular healing session with him, and he would not let me connect with him. And that's exactly what he told me. It's time for me to go. And I stalled and fudged. I didn't want to let him go. I'd lost far too many people over the last previous few years to be willing to let a beloved cat go. But I finally took him into the vet and had him euthanized the following Friday. And I knew it was the right thing for him. He had been extremely explicit, as I talk about in my book. He'd been very clear that it was time for him to go. He really wanted to go. It was ready. About a month later, I was at TMI again doing a remote viewing program. I had been so inspired by the remote viewing success at Gateway that I decided I really needed to get training in remote viewing. So this was probably about a month after Sammy had died. And we were doing just an ordinary exercise, didn't have any particular focus or concentration on anything. And I realized I could literally feel a weight on my chest in the darkened area where I was doing the exercise. It's called a check unit at TMI. It's like a blackout space, very dark. I could feel a weight on my chest. And then I felt a bump against my chin, and I realized it felt exactly like Sammy head bumping my chin, which was a favorite greeting of his. And I realized I could smell his fur and feel the tickle of it against my skin. And it was as clear and as real a manifestation as I have ever heard of. I could hear his voice in my head. We had a long conversation. I completely abandoned whatever exercise we were supposed to be doing according to the instructions coming across my headphones. And I just was astounded by the reality of being able to contact and communicate with him in such a real way.
That describes just what happened to me. That's fascinating.
Right. It's very profound. It's unmistakable. You can't prove it to anybody else. But if you've ever gone through an experience like this, you know it is absolutely real. And because I had no intention of trying to contact my dead cat, it was a complete surprise to me. I was not intending to do anything of that sort. I was intending to follow whatever the instructions were in the program.
And one of my favorite phrases comes from a wonderful book, Traveling Mercies. And it is, if you want to make God laugh, tell her your plans.
That is so true.
Isn't that precious?
That is absolutely true. I hadn't heard that before, but I love it.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. Cats seem to have something to do with death and with contacting people on the other side. And, witches or Wiccans is the more polite term for them. Were known to keep cats, and they were certainly wise women. But what interests me is that the Egyptians mummified cats, and everybody thinks that they worshipped cats because they kept the mice out of the granaries, which of course was, they were big farmers. But I wonder if they hadn't discovered this contact that cats seem to have with the world of the dead, because the Egyptians, of course, were absolutely obsessed with this.
I think that's possible, but, I don't just limit it to cats. I grew up with dogs, actually, so I absolutely adore dogs as much as I love cats, and I can find it very easy to connect with animals in general. I think animals have a very rich, profound spiritual life. I mean, for example, here's an example that did not make it into the book. I had a much older cat, Delilah, who died about a year or so before Sammy died. It must have been just about a year before, because at the time I had Delilah and I had Sammy, who was ill with kidney disease, and I had the two younger cats, Sasha and Tinkerbell. And Tinkerbell is a Tonkinese. She was about 6 months old when Delilah died, and Sasha was maybe a year old when Delilah died. But they were both very kittenish, and Tinkerbell, if you've ever had a Tonkinese, they're monkeys in cat suits. Getting them to stand still for any 3 seconds in a row is an impossible task.
Sounds wonderful.
Well, I woke up early in the morning and found Delilah had died overnight. And it was like 6 o'clock in the morning or something of that sort. So I wrapped up her body in a towel very gently, and I placed it in a quiet room on the guest room bed, as a matter of fact. And then I realized it was too early to talk to the crematorium to deal with her body. So I decided, well, it's time for me. I'll just do my grocery shopping now real early and then come back and deal with her later. So I went off to do my errands. About an hour or so later, I came back, and as I was walking down the hall beside the guest room, I looked in, and there, in a semicircle around Delilah's body, were Samson and Sasha and Tinkerbell, in age order, each of them in that Sphinx pose that cats get into.
Yeah.
And I just stood there. They were absolutely quiet and still, clearly keeping watch over the body.
Saying goodbye.
And as I stood in the doorway, each one of them, starting from the oldest to the youngest, one by one, stood up, very quietly walked over to her body, touched noses with her, and then left the room. One at a time, in age order, even the monkey in a cat suit, Tinkerbell. And I realized I had interrupted a kitty funeral.
Oh, that's beautiful. Maureen, I am going to take a little break right now and keep that image in my mind. It's a wonderful image. And when we come back, I want to talk about people, although I could talk about cats all day, but I want to talk about Charles and Mary. This is Ann Strieber for Dreamland. We'll be right back. Hi, Maureen. We're back.
Hi.
Hi. Tell me about Charles. Tell me about Mary. This is a fascinating story in your book.
Which of the Charles and Mary stories?
Oh, my.
The spoon bending, or the later one, the ones that right at the end of the book?
The one at the end of the book.
Okay. My friend Charles, I had known for almost 20 years. He was a retired physicist, PhD in physics. Also worked for the Department of Defense before he retired. He and I had been close friends for a goodly amount of time. We had co-authored some books together, some technical nonfiction together, and so forth. His wife, Mary, is a PhD in anthropology, and both of them live in the D.C. area. Charles developed ALS disease, which is Lou Gehrig's disease. It is a disease that is always fatal, and it's a tragic disease. It's the opposite of Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's, your mind dissolves, but your body stays fairly healthy. In ALS, your mind stays perfectly alert and healthy, but your body slowly gets immobilized.
I think that's what Stephen Hawking has. Am I right? Yeah.
Yes, it is. Although most people survive about 18 to 36 months after they're diagnosed. Stephen Hawking's been around for several decades, so he's an exceptional case. Nonetheless, a couple of years ago, or actually a little over a year ago, Charles was in the final stages of his disease. And he and I had talked a lot about death. He was very comfortable with it. He was a long-time meditator. He was a Reiki master in addition to being a physicist. And I got a phone call from Mary saying that I needed to get up to the D.C. area from my home in North Carolina and come see him because it was time for him to go. So I did a meditation on him just before I left to drive north, and I realized that there was a little piece of him that was hanging on to life very strongly, and that all the rest of him had already transitioned out of life, but there was this little piece of him that was not willing to let go. And I envisioned this little piece of him as if you remember the folk tale about the little boy who stuck his finger in the dike, the little Dutch boy.
Oh, yes.
That's very much the picture I got of him, that there's this little kid standing with his finger in the hole of the dike, protecting, and he was not going to take his finger out of that hole for anything because disaster was sure to happen in his mind if he did.
And you needed to tell him what Sammy told you.
Well, yes and no. I needed to convince him that it was okay for him to make some other choice.
Mm-hmm.
So this was on a Wednesday. I had done that, and by the time I got up and I talked to Mary, she recognized that as a piece of Charles's personality that I had not previously experienced. And she encouraged me to keep working with him to let him pass gracefully and peacefully out of this life. So Thursday and Friday and Saturday and Sunday, I kept doing these meditations with him, but there was this stubborn little piece of him was not willing to let go. Finally, on Saturday, I drove back home because the house was getting really crowded. All the family members were gathering for their final goodbyes to Charles. But I continued working on him from my home. Finally, early on Monday morning, I did a meditation with him. And I had a brilliant inspiration when I was talking to him. I asked the little boy if he would like to go and see where the rest of Charles was, where the rest of Charles' spirit was. And the little boy thought about that, and he said, yes, he would love to go.
Now, what little boy is this? Tell me now.
This is a little boy with a finger in the dike.
Yes, okay. This is Charles.
Charles that was hanging on to life.
Yes.
But he said I couldn't take his finger out of the dike. And I said, that's okay. I'll help you build a patch over the hole that will last until you come back.
Now, you were visualizing all this, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm. I mentally manifested great, big, huge boards and big nails, and he helped me make this huge, big patch over this little tiny hole. And he was okay, but he looked at that and he said, well, I really don't think I can leave because what if the patch starts leaking while I'm gone? So I held out my spiritual hand and manifested something that looked like a remote control, and it had a big red button and a red light on it. I said, this is a leak detector, and if it starts leaking, the red light will come on, and all you have to do is push this button, and you'll be back here, and you can put your finger back in the hole.
You know what amuses me about this, I just want to interrupt for a minute, is you're both scientists, and you're both approaching it scientifically, but in the spiritual world. But go on.
It's a gadget thing. I figured it was a guy thing. Guys love remote controls.
Yes.
But nonetheless, so he decided that was okay. So he took my, again, spirit body hand in one hand and the remote control device in the other hand, the leak detector, And I guided him to the part of the spiritual world where I had encountered the rest of Charles. And of course, the rest of Charles's spirit greeted this little boy piece of him with joy and thanksgiving. He was warmly welcomed. He was just smothered with love and affection and greeting and welcome. And so I didn't stay very long. I just, after a few moments, I said, okay, I'm going to leave now, but if you need to get back to that hole, you can choose. You can choose to stay where you are, or if you decide that you want to hang on a little longer to life, all you need to do is push this red button. But if you decide that you're ready to leave life now, just drop the leaf detector. It'll disappear, and you can stay here forever. It's your choice. And then I left. I went off and did some other spiritual meditations, and I brought myself back to the normal waking consciousness. That process took me about 10 minutes. And when I opened my eyes, there on the digital clock in front of me, it said 9:04 in the morning. Well, about early afternoon that day, I got a phone call from Mary that Charles, in fact, had passed away that morning, and he took his last breath at 9:05.
Oh, incredible.
So after we had sort of shared a few tears over the phone, I thought about that, and I realized that the little boy had to have dropped that leak detector almost as soon as I left. And it was incredibly profound to me that I had actually assisted someone to cross over in a graceful, comforting, welcoming way. That was just really profound for me.
What a privilege. And it made me think of, you talk about seeing him as a little boy, and he had to become a little boy, I think, to experience that. People who listen to the show know that I always say that my favorite shaman is Jesus. I'm not a traditional Christian, but I think he was a great shaman. And he said, you must become as little children. Yes. And I think that's probably what that means, that we have to become completely open and innocent in order to transcend these levels, if that's the right way to say it.
Well, it was a really profound and very, very touching realization. And, of course, I now know that Charles is fine, and I can go visit him. And, in fact, I have visited him since then. I've gotten some message for him, for his wife and daughter and so forth. And as they complete their grieving process, they'll be able to connect with him directly. Grief can often get in the way. Some people find it easy to connect with their deceased loved ones right after they die, and some people have to get a little past the grieving process before they can connect.
Well, you talk about being a remote viewer. You talk about getting into altered states and traveling out of body. You talk about spoon bending. And now you're talking about being a medium who contacts the dead. And this makes me think that you might be saying that we can all do this. And we talk about this a little more when we get back. This is Ann Strieber. Okay. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. So, Maureen, are you a medium now, too?
Well, I think the appropriate question is, what can we not do?
Oh, I love that.
One of the things that has really been driven home to me as I walk on this journey that I'm walking on is that these abilities are natural human abilities, because until I went to that gateway, I had never once had anything approximating a psychic experience whatsoever in my entire life.
Well, I think that gives the rest of us courage. Yeah, go on.
That training that, when I was trained in physics, I was trained, my mentor in college was not just a physicist, he was an experimental physicist. He thought theoreticians were too woo-woo out there to be trusted. In his view, and this is the doctrine that he indoctrinated me with, if you can't touch it, feel it, put it on a voltmeter or put it on a scale or take a ruler to it, and measure it in some way, it does not exist. And of course, things of the spirit are not at this point in time something that we can actively measure through scientific instruments.
You can't teach them that way, no.
No, and yet I have to drop back and say, if that is the truth, then that implies that until we had an ammeter, there was no such thing as electricity, no matter how many lightning bolts we saw. Until we had a magnetometer, there was no such thing as a magnetic field, no matter what compasses did. So the fact that we can't yet measure this thing cannot, in fact, dictate whether it's true or false or exists or doesn't exist. So that's the flaw in that experimental reasoning. But that hadn't really occurred to me until I started down this journey, that whole scientific materialism that indoctrinates our science studies is deeply flawed simply on a basis of simple logic. And the other thing that occurred to me is that you're right. I've done remote viewing, I've done channeling, I've done mediumship, I've done psychokinesis, I've done telepathy. I don't even want to tell you about remembering the future.
Oh,
I
wonderful.
mean, all of these things are things that I would have said were flatly impossible. If a psychic zero like me can go from being a psychic zero to being talented sort of across the spectrum in psychic skills, then clearly everybody can do this. And I do this, I demonstrate this very powerfully with my spoon bending. When I do a workshop, I always include training people on how to do spoon bending. Because when they do it themselves, they realize that it's not a hoax, that it can be done.
This is for real. I did some spoon bending once, and I thought that the secret was using cheap spoons. But go ahead.
No. I mean, I go to Kmart or Target, and I look at their flatware section, and I get their good stuff.
Uh-huh.
The 18-0 stainless steel stuff. This is the stuff you put on your holiday table, not the stuff that's, or it's your good everyday stainless. This is heavy-duty stainless steel. And I bring this around, and I don't do it myself. I hand out the forks and spoons to everybody in the group, and I say, here, you do it. Here's how you do it. I talk them through the process. When I did Charles and Mary on the spoon bending thing, for 24 hours before I did that exercise with them, they said, no, we don't want you to do this. You're going to look silly in front of my friends. It's going to fail because it's a hoax. We know it's a hoax. Well, 10 minutes into the session, Mary had a whole array of little dragons and birds and animals she constructed out of spoons and forks. She couldn't believe it. Her jaws dropped. But Charles at the time had ALS and had very poor strength in his hands. Even he was able to get the fork malleable enough so that he could bend and twirl it however he wanted. So everybody can do this stuff.
What does it feel like? What is the feeling that goes through you? Or is there any feeling that goes through you just before you're able to bend a spoon? Describe it.
You can actually feel the stainless steel undergo a state change so that it feels like slightly grainy modeling clay. Now, interestingly, the CIA back in the 70s or 80s actually proved that psychic spoon bending is true, because you can take a spoon that a magician has bent using a hoax, one of the many hoax techniques, and a spoon that someone has psychically bent. If you do an electron micrograph of the crystal structure of the hoax spoon, you'll see that the crystals are all broken and as if it's undergone mechanical deformation, which is exactly what's happened. They've bent it against the tabletop or done any of a number of similar things. But if you take a spoon that's been psychically bent and you do that same electron micrograph of the crystalline structure of that spoon, it looks like it's been cold cast. The crystals are not broken. The crystals are in the same structure as if it was heated to melting point and then recast into that new shape. Now, the problem is, of course, that it happens at finger temperature. So It never gets hot. It never gets above whatever the natural temperature of your fingers are. That violates more laws of science than I can even begin to count. It's physically impossible to do by the science that I was taught and by the science that I know. It's one of the few psychic experiences that I have absolutely no way legitimately of explaining away. I mean, I can explain away telepathy by talking about holographic universes and quantum entanglement. I can explain away remote viewing and all of these things as being scientifically justified by cutting-edge physics theories or cosmology theories. I have a very difficult time explaining my spoon bending, and yet everybody can do it. When I teach it, 85 to 95% of the people in my workshops are succeed at it the very first time they try.
Now, I remember I told you when we were just talking on the phone that when next time you have a workshop to let us know, because we will put it up on our website, folks, so you could go and learn to spoon bend yourself. But you know what this reminds me of, Maureen, is crop circles, because crop circles are mysteriously made with bursts of high heat, and they can tell real crop circles from fake crop circles, quote unquote, which have been made by flattening the grain with boards on feet and things, and they don't understand how the quote unquote real ones are made. But they do know they're made with bursts of high heat, mysterious bursts of high heat, because they enlarge the plant nodes in a certain way, and they can always spot it. And this is very similar.
Well, it is. Basically, what we're talking about is the intentional control of subtle energies. These are energies that we can't measure. We don't have instruments that can measure them yet. And yet they have to be real, because if they weren't real, how could they transform stainless steel into a malleable material at room temperature? So clearly the energies exist. And if the energies can make stainless steel act like it's been heated to melting point and then recast into a new shape, then certainly they would be able to flatten some plants growing in a field. It's the same sort of thing. These are subtle energies. We can't measure them yet. That doesn't mean they don't exist, any more than electricity didn't exist before we had our first ammeter.
You know, I think one of the problems is that we were all trained in, I guess for want of a better word, Newtonian physics. You were much more trained in it than I was. But we now know that that's not how the world works. The world works according to quantum physics. And we're kind of like the flat earthers of medieval times who thought that if they just walked long enough, they would fall off the edge of the earth.
Well, actually, I was trained in quantum physics. Quantum physics has been around for a century.
Uh-huh.
And it's only in the past maybe 10 years or less that quantum physicists have recognized the implications of quantum physics.
Yes, they didn't want to. They ran from it before.
Right. The truth is the implication of things like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and quantum and other quantum effects, the probability function wave, for example, are such that there is no separation between the observer and the observed. It implies the connectedness of us all, and it implies the preeminence of the mind. Because what defines an observer? If the observer changes the system being observed, what defines an observer? The observer is something with a mind. So those implications are only just now beginning to be realized by quantum scientists and by physicists and other scientists. And they're a little afraid, I think, to make that leap into understanding.
Even Einstein couldn't do it. Couldn't stand it.
No, he could not. He could not. But no other quantum physicist has really been able to do that. The new generation that's just starting to get trained in it and starting to understand that this does imply certain characteristics, that there's something special about mind, there's something special about consciousness, there's something special about being conscious, being aware, that changes the universe.
You think this is a proof for the existence of God?
I don't know that it's possible to prove the existence of God, but I do know that every single person that I'm aware of who has done any serious exploration of altered states of consciousness becomes deeply aware of the connectedness, the oneness of, they become more spiritual. In fact, we were talking about DMT, that spirit molecule
Yes.
earlier at the beginning of the program. The difference between people who have these experiences by taking a shot of this drug versus those who get the experiences by learning to meditate and focusing and really working at it, or having near-death experiences, or any of the variety of sort of, I'm going to say, quote, natural ways of getting there. The difference between those two groups is those who get it to the shot, they have this profound experience and it's wonderful, and 2 years later they're the same human beings. The people who get it the hard way, who meditate, who work at it, who do deep spiritual explorations, those people have the same profound experiences. They describe them the same way. They meet the same spiritual beings. And 2 years later, they're a completely different human being. They tend to be more spiritual, more religious, nearly always more religious than they were before, even if it's not in the base of a religion, but they are more religious, more spiritual. They tend to be nicer people. Sometimes, like me, they change their whole careers. The difference is that it's a permanent change in you, and versus just a quick one shot. Have a great experience, go for the thrill, and then it's over.
That's very interesting. I've sometimes wondered if mine is going to wear away, and sometimes I've thought that it would, and then it doesn't. It comes back. I got a gift of what I call shamanic intuition, for want of a better word. But I noticed on page 187, you describe what I think is the same thing. You say, one change was that I was now strongly connected to spiritual guidance on a nearly daily basis.
True.
And
True.
It's a very different way to live.
Yes, it is. I've changed my whole life on the basis of spiritual guidance. And the spiritual guidance led me to say I can't do this job anymore because it eats at my soul. It led me to move from San Diego to North Carolina. It has led me to change all aspects of my life because it's better for my soul than it is to continue doing what I had been doing. And spiritual guidance has become a really important part of my life. And I think it is for many of the people who do this kind of exploration over the long run.
Well, that's, I think, a wonderful way to sum up this interview, and I've enjoyed talking with you so much, Maureen, and I know our listeners are going to enjoy it, listening to this discussion so much, and they are going to all get your wonderful book, Suddenly Psychic, A Skeptic's Journey, because it is really something very special. Thanks for talking with us.
Next up on Dreamland, Linda Moulton Howe and I talk about junk DNA, an incredible mystery. Get ready for it. You're about to experience something you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science discovery and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets the others dare not. earthfiles.com. This week she's reporting on a mystery that is beginning to haunt scientists, the mystery of so-called junk DNA. Is it junk or something far, far more remarkable? Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. Human Genome Project. We've been hearing those words since 1990 when the U.S. Department of Energy and U.S. National Institutes of Health formally created that project. The goal has been to identify all the genes in human DNA, the blueprint for a human body. And you might wonder why the Department of Energy was involved. Well, the answer that they give is because since the creation of atomic bombs in the 1940s, scientists have tried to understand what radiation does to human bodies and what mutations it causes in human DNA. After 16 years and the hard work of 2,800 scientists around the world, there are some answers and surprises. First, if you think of the human body as a book, then all of the pages and text together are the genome. The word was coined from genes and chromosomes. The DNA in every cell contains the whole book about how to make a human body. The words in each genome book are the genes. The Human Genome Project expected to find at least 100,000 genes were necessary to create one human body. But one of the big surprises is that the number of genes now is only about 22,000, much less than several other Earth creatures, especially plants, which have as many as 40,000 genes. The main reason, they think, for the smaller number of genes than expected is that human and primate genes are capable of multitasking the production of proteins. You might say that the Human Genome Book has a more advanced text, but it still takes 3 billion letters to write out those 22,000 words. The letters are the nucleotides, or base pairs known as adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And they line up along our double helix DNA like zeros and ones in the software of computers. Now we come to a current main problem in the Human Genome Project. What is the punctuation in a string of 3 billion letters? Scientists now know some of the fragments of sentences, but they don't know full sentences. That could take another decade at least to figure out how all of those letters and words make our bodies work. Another big puzzle is that inside some of the 22,000 genome words are strings of repeating letters. Imagine seeing 100-letter G's and not having a clue why they are there. Scientists call long strings of repeating letters non-coding sequences or junk DNA. Strangely, there is a lot of junk DNA in the human DNA molecule. At least 97% is junk DNA. Well, that's why a January 11th, 2007 Canadian blog by someone named John Stokes and distributed on the web caught my attention. The headline was, quote, "Scientists find extraterrestrial genes in human DNA," and the first paragraph said, "A group of researchers working at the Human Genome Project indicate that they made an astonishing scientific discovery. They believe so-called non-coding sequences in human DNA is no less than genetic code of extraterrestrial life forms," unquote. The Canadian blog says that the name of the Human Genome Project group leader responsible for the discovery that junk DNA is genetic code of ETs is Professor Sam Chang. Well, I could not find any Google listing for Professor Sam Chang, so I decided to get a reality check on the truth from John McPherson, Ph.D. Dr. McPherson is currently Associate Professor in the Department of Human and Molecular Genetics at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. Over the past 10 years, Dr. McPherson was also co-director of the Genome Center at Washington University in St. Louis. There, he was the lead scientist in that university's efforts to map the human genome as well as mouse and chicken genomes. I began by asking him, what is junk DNA?
That still remains to be seen, but it could be in many different things. There are some of the DNA that we have termed junk in the past, which may have been essentially a virus that infected us and jumped around and made copies of itself within our DNA. And then over time, because that eventually would destroy us, it was quieted down, but its remnants are still there. You can activate these things artificially in cell culture, for example, and you can get them to jump all over the place. There are cases where disease has been shown to be caused by one of these elements moving into a gene. It gets propagated in their family, and that caused the disease. And so there are some what we call mobile elements in the genome. And where they come from originally, it's a good question, but the sort of theory is that they were just basically viruses that came along and tagged along with us. So, and genomes are growing and expanding, and some are decreasing. This junk DNA, right now, it may have a role. The spacing that it puts in our genome may be required. We don't really know.
How long do you think it will be before you really do know?
Oh, I don't know. We certainly have some ideas of what things are doing now, but probably in the next 10 years, I think we'll have a better idea.
And it will take an entire other decade.
I believe it'll take a decade to figure out much of the genome. Even then, there'll be lots of questions, but just to even come up with what we believe are all the genes and how they interact with each other is at least another decade.
Wow, that's 2017.
Yep. Yeah, getting the sequence was just the start. It really was. It took a long time to get it. It was a 15-year project from the very beginning, and not all sequencing was really done in the last few years, but it was all the preparation before that of learning how to do it. And now that we have the sequence, we have to figure out what it does. And that's one reason we're sequencing lots of other genomes, is so that we can compare them. And by comparing them, figure out what things do.
Is there anything you found that would fall into the category of baffling in the sequencing of the human genes?
The biggest thing that's baffling to us is how it all works. It's often referred to as the parts list. We know the genes, we can see them, we can look at them, but we still have to figure out what they do. And just by looking at the sequence, we can't. There's some that we can predict, we think what it does, but there's many that we can't. And so it's still a big puzzle. It's just like maybe an analogy might be a jigsaw puzzle where you've got all the pieces, but you don't have the box that shows you what the picture is. You have to put it together and figure out what it all is. And we're sort of in that stage in many ways. There's some genes we know a lot about, but there's many genes that we have no idea what they do. And so that's the baffling part to me, is just still there's so much work to be done just to figure out how it all works.
Now, have you ever heard of a Professor Sam Chang?
Sam Chang. No, that name doesn't ring a bell.
So you personally have not worked with him on a genome project?
No, not that I know of. And there are a lot of people involved that we never got to meet, but we only met through emails and things, but that name doesn't ring a bell.
And in the capacity that you had in St. Louis and today, should you know most of the main people?
Most of the main characters, yeah. Although it was very international, and there were some labs that we never got to go to or meet the people from, and so some of the names didn't stick in my head from back then.
Well, the reason I'm asking is this is a January 11th, 2007 Canadian National Newspaper story, and I'm going to just read to you what I have here that was sent to me in an email. Scientists find extraterrestrial genes in human DNA. Do civilizations of advanced human beings exist scattered in the galaxy? And the author is John Stokes, Stokes. And this is the beginning that leads up to the name Professor Sam Chang. A group of researchers working at the Human Genome Project indicates that they made an astonishing scientific discovery. They believe so-called 97% non-coding sequences in human DNA is no less than genetic code of extraterrestrial life forms. Says Professor Sam Chang, the group leader. Non-coding sequences, originally known as junk DNA, were discovered years ago, and their function remained a mystery.
Well, I've never heard of that. I've never heard of that before, and it certainly doesn't sound very credible to me. But
well, I'm just wondering how this entire article could be made up.
Actually, I'm just looking on the web as I'm talking to you. It sounds like a blog posting, but do that search. There's all sorts of things pointing towards that. So I find it actually kind of funny. But
can you at least comment on the possibility that Homo sapiens sapien may have been seeded by life from someplace else, and that it might somehow show up in some way in our genome sequencing project?
Well, as far as I know, there's no evidence to support that. This is all news to me.
Crick and Watson won the Nobel Prize for describing the double helix DNA molecule, my gosh, what is that, 40 years ago or something?
1953, I think.
They had done a joint paper that was published in Icarus, which is the astrophysical journal.
Mm-hmm.
And their hypothesis was that because there was one spiral DNA molecule in all life on the planet, that it had to mean that panspermia, the act of seeding DNA on this planet, had to have been our actual origins.
Right. I've seen theories like that where people believe that DNA or bacteria or something came to Earth on an asteroid or what have you, and that DNA and RNA wasn't formed in the bubbling oceans of the world. You know, anything's possible because they're all theories at this point. We don't know for sure where things came from. So it is possible that the first DNA came to the world from outside and then evolved. Whether you want to bring up religious arguments or not, that's fine too. I mean, I think they all can, in a way, fit into those same arguments. You could say that the first DNA was seeded by God, or you can say it came from an extraterrestrial source. I mean, who knows?
Would you agree with Ordell, Crick Watson, and that group that it is impossible that all of this huge planet would have exactly the same DNA in all creatures?
It's an interesting observation, and you might think that there would be, if it was all coming from the primordial soup, so to speak, that there may be different sources that came up in different ways of doing it. And there are, for example, RNA viruses just have RNA, don't have any DNA, and so some of the theories are that the RNA came first and then DNA evolved later. I don't know. It may be that it was such a rare event for it to happen at all that did seed everything.
Mm-hmm.
I think any theory is just as likely as the next at this point in time.
Would you and your colleagues have any way of identifying something that was introduced in the gene sequence that would seem highly artificial to you compared to the rest of genome sequencing of other life on the planet?
Probably not. I mean, if you look hard enough, you'll find patterns in anything, and then depending how you want to interpret them. I mean, there's even, for example, there's lots of articles on people who, if you take every fifth letter of every third word of the Bible, you spell out this or that, right? And it's the same sort of thing. If you look at patterns long enough and find different ways of looking at them, you will eventually find something by chance. So whether we would recognize something, I don't think we'd be able to recognize anything as being out of the ordinary. We can certainly recognize patterns within the DNA, but what maybe we just don't understand what they do yet, and they may be involved in the structure of the DNA and how it all is compacted into each cell and this sort of thing. We just don't know that yet.
So the bottom line is that even if Homo sapiens sapien was the product of some kind of seeding and then genetic manipulation by other intelligences, that humans would never be able to differentiate between the current DNA that they are and it having been manipulated by another intelligence.
It would be unlikely to be certain, that's for sure. I think you could look at a lot of patterns and you can come up with a lot of things, but I think someone else can look at it a little different way and see something different. So I think people will see what they want to see in the patterns.
Now this comes to the work Pablo Svante, who has been doing that work in Germany on that. I think it was an elbow that was found in a cave, and they think that the cave, going back to Neanderthals, was 40,000 some years old.
Right.
But if there were 19 major differences between the genome sequencing on the Neanderthals bone compared to modern Homo sapiens sapien, and the conclusion was that there could not have been sexual intercourse between Neanderthals and Cro-Magnon Homo sapiens sapien.
There's certainly more differences than 19 that have been observed. It's very difficult sequencing because most of the samples are contaminated with modern DNA, and so it's difficult to sort out the Neanderthal sequences from the modern human. But there are a few samples that are supposedly uncontaminated, but DNA is not stable either, and over time it changes. And so the other problem you have is determining which changes are real and which are things that have happened to the DNA over time. So the DNA degrades in such a way that bases change. So when we sequence them, we see a different base there than was actually there at the time. So I think it's still very early on to be analyzing that data to make any statements whatsoever about it.
So if there was no sexual connection between the Neanderthals line and the Cro-Magnon Homo sapiens sapien that came later, where did Cro-Magnon Homo sapiens sapien come from?
Well, they didn't have to breed together to diverge, right? I mean, they could be geographically isolated offshoot in evolution, which evolved independently. If we all evolved throughout time out of Africa, there could definitely be groups that were geographically isolated and evolved independently.
If there was manipulation of DNA in already evolving primates on the planet, then it's possible that Homo sapien or Neanderthals or even Homo erectus could have been the product of some kind of genetic tampering.
I don't believe that, but if you look at all over the planet, there are species of birds, for example, that are clearly related but cannot interbreed. How did they become all different? Well, they became different because they isolated in different areas and they started to evolve to adapt to the local environment. So the beak changed so that it could eat a certain thing. And then as they changed and evolved, the chromosomes changed enough that they could no longer interbreed. They all are very, very related and can be connected back to some progenitor bird. So the fact that they're different doesn't mean that anyone manipulated them. They just changed over time.
And so the bottom line to all of this is that even if there was an extraterrestrial manipulation or seeding of DNA on this planet or other planets, we would never be able to prove it.
I would think that we probably couldn't prove it. It'd be very, very difficult for us to prove that.
Now, one of the headlines in 2004 was, and I'm reading from MIT, a news release, the number of genes in the human genome is lower than previously estimated, considerably lower. Could you elaborate and explain this?
Well, when we started sequencing the genome, the prediction was that there'd be 100,000 human genes. That prediction was based largely on the few genes that had been sequenced. Their size was around 30,000 base pairs, and since the human genome was 3 billion base pairs, just doing the math, it seemed that if the average gene was 30,000, then it would be that there were 100,000 genes. I think that's sort of the simplistic view of where that came from. Of the things that had been sequenced at the time, the C. elegans, the worm, was being sequenced, and it looked like there were 20,000 genes in it. And so it seemed reasonable that maybe as part of our arrogance that we thought that there should be then 100,000 human genes. In the end, when we sequenced it, it turned out to be, and it's still a debatable point actually, how many genes there are, but there's maybe something like 22,000 human genes. And the difference is not the number of genes, but the complexity of the genes that has more to do with the complexity of the organism.
If I understand what you just said, you mean if we have 22,000 and other creatures may have 30,000 or more, that our gene sequencing is more complex?
Our gene, one gene tends to make multiple proteins, whereas a lot of things like the worm, the elegans, one gene makes one protein. And our genes at least make 2 proteins on average, when some genes make many, many proteins. It's called differential splicing, and it's a way of mixing and matching parts within that gene to make a different protein. So we get more complexity out of the genes that we have than something like worm.
Is there on the planet another animal that is very similar to our gene sequencing in the complexity?
In complexity, yeah. We sequence now some of the primates, chimpanzee and macaque and things like that, and they have very similar genomes to our own. Almost any mammalian genome have roughly about the same number of genes as humans. I think the largest numbers I've seen are in plants, actually. Some of the plants have 40,000 genes, and plants tend to be chemical factories. They tend to produce a lot of compounds to protect themselves from insects since they can't run away like we can. They're stuck in one spot, and so they have a lot of chemical synthesis machinery, and that may account for a lot of the genes that they have.
Of all of our primate colleague Earth life, which is the closest to Homo sapiens sapiens?
Chimpanzee.
The chimpanzee is closer than an orangutan or a gorilla or others?
Yeah, I believe so, yeah. We haven't finished sequencing all the others, but the chimpanzee so far is the closest.
And what is the current focus of your work right now?
Right now, we are using the information we have to go in and sequence genes within individuals looking for the cause of disease. So we're looking for differences in the genes, which may be related then to the disease that we're studying. We have a number of projects going on, epilepsy, obesity, and many others. We're looking at cancer as well. And the idea then is we now know what a normal gene looks like by doing the sequencing we did. And so what we're looking for now are variations of those genes which may be associated with disease.
Is there a particular gene-disease link that you think is firm that might be in a disease that we would be surprised about?
Oh, I'm always surprised. I'm surprised every day by things that we see. What we're finding, I think, and it's early days, but many of the diseases that we know about in the past, like cystic fibrosis, there was a very definite change in the gene that we could associate with the disease. And now what we're looking at are what we call complex disorders, where it may be subtle variations in a number of genes, which all add up to give you the disease. And these subtle variations, you may find someone without the disease has some of those, but it's having all of them together that gives the disease. And so it can be very difficult to tease it out. And so that's why we're sequencing lots of genes in a lot of people, looking for these associations where a change in this gene isn't enough to give you the disease, but a change in gene 1 plus the change in gene 2 plus the change in gene 3 all add up to give you the disease. And I think the surprising thing is what we're seeing is just how much variation there are in all the genes in all of us. But it depends on how they're mixed and matched, whether you get heart disease and things like that.
And as you know, Whitley and our Dreamland listeners, in 1983 at Kirtland Air Force Base here in Albuquerque, when I was working on that home box office special for television, I was shown an alleged briefing paper for the President of the United States about extraterrestrial biological entities and their interactions with this planet. And one of the paragraphs in that paper said these extraterrestrials manipulated DNA in already evolving primates to create Homo sapien. And when I talk with Dr. McPherson, who is a very open-minded and very intelligent person who is one of the handful of people on this planet very close to the Human Genome Project, and realize that when he says there is no way that we could prove, especially not from a string of 100 or 1,000 G's or A's of what is called junk DNA, I wonder what provoked this Canadian blog and this bogus description of the extraterrestrial intervention through this made-up Professor Sam Chang, but it is information that harkens back to leaks and releases to me and to others about this, in fact, being one of the historic facts of the evolution of life on this planet. It is a conundrum. If we can't prove it, how did the government ever accept it to be a fact in the first place?
Well, yeah, that indeed would be the question, and I would like to continue on with it, but you have neatly tailored this to the point where I have about 9 seconds left to talk.
I would have said we're flat out impossible, and
like what? Like what? Tell me.
Well, I was remote viewing, for example. They called us. We were in a large group. They said, "Okay, we're writing down some latitude and longitude coordinates. I want you to describe the target that is at those latitude and longitude." Well, I'm not a cartographer. I don't know much, or a pilot. I don't know much about latitude and longitude other than very vague general terms. And yet, I not only described the target, I actually drew 2 sketches of it that were in the exact perspective of the 2 photographs they told us showed us after the exercise was done. Then they did a second target, and the 2 trainers looked at each other and said, "Well, we can't remember what the coordinates of this one are, but the target is somewhere in North America. Describe the target."
So they gave you no information at all, basically.
Well, it's somewhere in North America.
Well, I guess that's information, yeah.
That certainly narrowed it down quite a lot. I mean, I knew not to draw the pyramids in Egypt, but I got that target too, and again drew it from the perspective of the photographs of the target that they showed us when the exercise was done. Now that completely blew me away. How was I able to do that? I actually named the building of the first target, and I mean, I just was flummoxed. I couldn't understand how that could happen. I also was doing things like I had communication with my best friend's deceased mother, got a message for her.
So you became a medium, at least for a moment. I know some mediums. They're fascinating.
That's
people.
right. I was channeling spiritual information. I was precognitive the whole week. One of the things they do in Gateway is they protect you. They don't give you an agenda saying this is such and such is going to happen. In fact, the trainers are very careful not to give you pre-warning about what.
On the Edge have worked for them. In fact, someone we worked very closely with for many years who's now died, who Whitley has been in contact with, even though he has died, and he's still doing scientific work, just like your cat Sammy is still doing cat work, was Bill Mallow, who's worked for the Southwest Research Institute, who did a lot of CIA work. But that's just an aside. Tell me more. Tell me about your journey.
Well, my journey didn't have anything to do with what I was doing professionally. In fact, it was almost antithetical to what I was doing during my day job.
So how'd you decide to do it? What happened?
Well, I had gone through a really difficult period. I had a period where I had taken a break from my career to stay home and look after my mom, and she died. And in fact, I had 4 deaths in the space of about 4 months. and had another person I was very close to be diagnosed as mortally ill. And the result of all that was I was really messed up. I was just personally completely frazzled, and somehow, by accident, if you believe in accidents, which I don't think I any longer believe in accidents.
I don't either.
Somehow,
go on.
Or coincidence, I don't believe in those either. Somehow, I ran across the website for the Monroe Institute.
Now that is a coincidence.
Yeah, because it's not exactly a big name website, and for some reason I was attracted to the concept of the Gateway Voyage program, which is a 1-week retreat in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, and at the time I was living in Southern California. And I thought, wow, that sounds like so cool, a whole week of nothing to do. And I hadn't had a vacation in a really long time.
Folks, this is
basically Saturday at dinner until Friday morning. And so Saturday afternoon is a period of sort of getting to know whoever the trainers are. There usually are 2 trainers for every program. And you have a one-on-one intake interview with one of the 2 trainers. Well, almost the first words out of my trainer's mouth in our intake interview was, now, don't worry if you don't go out of body on this program because, not everybody goes out of body during Gateway. And I thought to myself, go out of your body? Why would anyone want to do that? And, oh, my, I think I've jumped down the wrong rabbit hole.
Oh.
And it got worse because at dinner that night, after dinner, we all congregated in a room and did the typical thing that workshops do. Went around the room and everyone introduced themselves. And I realized that every single other participant in this program was a healer, a shaman, a meditator, a new ager of some sort. And I was the techie nerd in the entire group. And I was sure that I had completely jumped into the wrong place. I had no idea. I started wondering, can I get my money back? Can I just go hang out in a hotel in Charlottesville, Virginia until my plane takes off on Friday? How do I get out of this?
And yet you were probably the most valuable person there because you came from science and not any sort of belief. And on this show and on our website, we think that skepticism is it's the only attitude. If you don't keep things in question, you don't find out anything. But go on.
Well, I think that's true. And I do have to say that within 48 hours of starting the program, my skepticism was in tatters. I found myself doing things that prior to the program,
guest who excites me very much, Maureen Caudill, the author of Suddenly Psychic. She's a physicist, and she became suddenly psychic. And we have a lot in common because we both have been visited by our deceased cats. And there's a wonderful quote from this book where Maureen says, "It isn't that the mystics have changed their views of the world. Instead, science is at last beginning to lose just a tiny bit of the arrogance that insisted that cold materialism was the only way to understand the universe." What a journey we're going to take. Maureen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Anne.
Well, tell me, now you are a scientist, you are a physicist. Tell me a little bit about your scientific background.
Okay. I was trained in physics at the University of Connecticut. I have a master's degree from Cornell. I spent over 20 years not actually doing physics, but in the computer science industry.
Uh-huh.
And my specialty was artificial intelligence and neural networks. And I spent about 15 years working in that field and doing cutting-edge research for the DoD in
that's the Department of Defense, folks. That's serious stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. My clients were the 3-letter agencies, the intelligence agencies, typically, and basically doing research in how to make computers act more like people, be more intelligent, however you define that term.
Well, it's very interesting. We have often found with the people we have met and interviewed that the government, the Department of Defense, is much more on the cutting edge than people think. And a lot of people who are where they teach you how to go out of your body.
Actually, it's not. They teach you how to go into altered states.
Oh, okay.
It's different from going out of your body. I mean, it's going out of your body. They're not opposites. But the goal of the Gateway Voyage program is not so much to teach you how to go out of body. It's to teach you how to go into altered states of consciousness and do it in a safe, controlled, reliable fashion. And they use a technology that they've developed over about 40 years called HemiSync. It's basically you put on the headphones and listen to the sound that's coming over your headphones. And within about 10 minutes, everybody's in an altered state of consciousness. I mean, it's very reliable. You can put it on to anybody. What appealed to me about that was it's a technology. Wow, I'm a techno nerd. That just totally appealed to me completely.
So there are sciences. There is science at the edge, or maybe even on the other side of the edge.
Yes, and it's been tested. It's safe. It's reliable, and it's science. It's sound. There's equipment. There's like stuff that lets you do it. It's not something vague and fuzzy like chanting or drumming, which, being a techie nerd, that just had no appeal to me whatsoever.
Although we do now understand how drumming gets people into altered states, but people didn't used to understand that. Go ahead.
Well, absolutely. It's not that those other techniques don't work, because they do. But being a techie nerd, I wanted the technological stuff. I wanted the machines to help me get there. And truthfully, I didn't really know what I'd signed up for. And so the first thing that happened, the program at TMI, at the Monroe Institute, which is called TMI, when from Saturday after